The rain hadn't let up since the night before. It drummed on the roof like an impatient visitor, filling the house with its relentless rhythm. I was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of oatmeal for breakfast. Liam had been acting strange for days, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The news on the small TV in the corner warned of potential flooding. Heavy rains have already caused rivers to rise, the anchor said, but no one round here ever took those warnings seriously. The river had always stayed in its banks, always. Liam was in the living room, pacing as he talked on the phone. His voice was low, but the walls in this house were thin. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the name Rachel caught my attention. Rachel, his first love, the woman I'd heard about more times than I cared to remember. "I'll leave after the storm settles," he said. "You're the one I should have been with all along, Rachel. I was stupid to think this could work." My stomach twisted. I set the spoon down and walked toward the living room. My heart was pounding, but I kept telling myself I must have misheard. "Liam," I said, interrupting him. He turned, startled. "What's going on?" He ended the call abruptly, his face a mix of guilt and frustration. "Nothing, just work stuff." "Work stuff? Really?" Because it sounded like you were talking to Rachel. His eyes darted away, and I knew I'd caught him. "Don't make this a big deal, Mia. You always overthink everything." "Overthink?" My voice cracked. "You're planning to leave me, aren't you?" Liam sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine. Yes, I am. I can't do this anymore. You're holding me back, Mia. This life, this house, this mess, it's not what I want." "After everything I've done for you?" My voice rose, hot with anger and disbelief. "I've been here through all the struggles, Liam. I gave up my job, my dreams, to support you. And now, because of Rachel—" "Don't put this on her," he snapped. "You've been dull, Mia. Clingy, dependent. Rachel's successful, driven. She's everything you're not." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Tears stung my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "How could you say that to me? How could you do this?" "I don't owe you an explanation," he said coldly. "You should have been stronger, smarter, but you're not." He grabbed my coat from the rack and tossed it at me. "Take your stuff and go." "Liam, it's pouring outside." I gestured toward the window, where sheets of rain obscured the view. "Not my problem," he said, standing by the door. "Figure it out." I stood frozen, drenched in disbelief and betrayal, until he opened the door and gestured for me to leave. The rain soaked through my coat instantly as I stepped into it, my feet splashing in the puddles already forming on the porch. As the door slammed behind me, I told myself one thing. This would not be the end of my story. The rain didn't just fall. It poured like the heavens had torn open, soaking me to the bone as I walked aimlessly down the street. My small bag, packed hastily with a change of clothes, and my wallet felt like dead weight. My thoughts were a mess, Liam's betrayal looping over and over in my head. How could he do this to me? How could I have been so blind? I turned a corner, the sound of rushing water snapping me out of my thoughts. At first, I thought it was just the storm playing tricks on me. Then the flood sirens pierced the air, a chilling, high-pitched wail that made my stomach drop. The streets were filling fast. Water surged over the curb, swallowing sidewalks and pooling around car tires. A few brave or foolish drivers tried to navigate through it, but the water only rose higher, faster, trapping their vehicles. People shouted as they splashed toward higher ground, the panic in their voices unmistakable. I froze for a second, unsure of what to do. The water was creeping toward me, cold and relentless, and I realized I needed to move. Now, a wave of dirty water surged past me, almost knocking me off my feet. "Oh, God," I muttered, grabbing a lamppost for support. My shoes were already soaked, the water lapping at my ankles. Across the street, I saw a small child clinging to their mother, both of them crying as they struggled to climb onto a parked car. "Get to higher ground," someone yelled, but their voice was lost in the chaos. I needed to think, to find somewhere safe. The convenience store up ahead, its flat roof was low enough to climb. I waded toward it, the water now up to my knees, pushing against me like it had a mind of its own. When I reached the store, I clung to a drain pipe and hoisted myself up, my hands slipping on the wet metal. My muscles screamed with the effort, but I made it, collapsing onto the flat roof and gasping for breath. From my perch, I could see the destruction unfolding around me. Cars floated like toys, smashed against buildings by the current. People shouted for help, their voices a chaotic chorus of fear and desperation. Then I saw her, Mrs. Hart, my elderly neighbor, waving from a second-story window across the street. Water was pouring into her house, the furniture inside floating like debris. She banged on the window, her frail arms shaking, her mouth forming the word help over and over. My heart raced. What could I do? I was safe for the moment, but she wasn't. The current was too strong to swim through, and the water was rising fast. Hang on, I shouted, hoping she could hear me. I scanned the area, searching for anything that might help. A half-submerged canoe caught my eye, tangled in a chain-link fence a little further down the street. It was risky, but it was my only option. I climbed down from the roof, my legs trembling. The water was at my waist now, pushing against me with terrifying force. I fought my way toward the canoe, grabbing hold of it and wrenching it free. A broken broomstick floated nearby, and I snatched it up to use as a makeshift paddle. Please don't tip, I whispered, climbing into the unsteady canoe. Balancing carefully, I paddled toward Mrs. Hart's house, each stroke of the broomstick a battle against the relentless current. When I reached her window, she was crying, her face pale with fear. I can't swim, she sobbed, shaking her head. You don't have to, I said, forcing a calm I didn't feel. I'll get you out. With her trembling hands, she opened the window, and I helped her climb into the canoe. It tipped dangerously, but we managed to steady it. She clutched my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Thank you, dear, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the water. We paddled back to the convenience store, the journey feeling like a lifetime. Every second, I worried the canoe would tip or we'd be swept away. But somehow, we made it, and I helped Mrs. Hart onto the roof. Exhausted, I collapsed beside her, the rain still pounding down. Around us, the floodwaters continued to rise, swallowing the town in its icy grip. But for the first time since that awful morning, I felt a spark of something other than despair. I wasn't just surviving, I was fighting, and I wasn't going to give up. Not yet. The rain didn't let up for a second. Every inch of me was drenched, and the cold seemed to seep into my bones. Mrs. Hart sat beside me on the convenience store roof, her frail frame shivering despite the raincoat I had draped over her. Thank you, dear, she said softly, her voice shaking. I don't know what I would have done. Before I could respond, a faint sound cut through the storm. A child crying. My heart jumped. Do you hear that? I asked, scanning the flooded streets below. Mrs. Hart nodded. It's coming from over there. Through the rain and chaos, I spotted her. A small girl, no more than 6 or 7 years old, clinging to a street lamp as the water surged around her waist. She was crying out for her parents, her voice trembling with fear. I have to help her, I said, my stomach nodding. The water was even higher now, and the current looked stronger than ever, but I couldn't just leave her there. Be careful, Mia, Mrs. Hart said, clutching my arm briefly before letting go. I grabbed the sheet I'd used earlier to help Mrs. Hart and tied one end securely around a metal pipe on the roof. The other end went around my waist. Hold on to this, I told her. If it feels like I'm in trouble, pull me back. Mrs. Hart nodded, her hands trembling as she gripped the sheet. I slid off the roof into the icy water, gasping as the cold hit me. The current pushed against me with brutal force, but the makeshift rope held steady. Step by step, I fought my way toward the girl. She looked up at me, her face streaked with rain and tears. It's okay, sweetie, I called out, trying to sound calm. I'm here to help you. The closer I got, the harder the water pushed. But I finally reached her. Her small hands clung to mine like a lifeline. Where are your parents? I asked gently. They were with me, she stammered, but the water took them. My heart broke. I'm going to take you somewhere safe, okay? Hold on to me. I lifted her into my arms, the effort making my muscles scream. Balancing against the current, I slowly made my way back to the roof, using the sheet as a guide. Mrs. Hart's face lit up with relief when we reached the edge, and she helped pull the girl up. What's your name, sweetheart? I asked as I climbed back onto the roof. Ellie, she whispered. clinging to me like a lifeline. Ellie, you're safe now, I said, brushing wet hair from her face. We'll look for your parents when the water goes down, but for now, we stick together. Mrs. Hart nodded in agreement. We'll take care of you. I looked out at the flooded streets, the weight of responsibility pressing on me. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. I had people depending on me now. Somehow, I'd have to figure out what to do next. The rain was relentless, pounding down on us like it had a personal vendetta. The water was up to my chest now, icy and murky, carrying all kinds of debris. A trash can floated by, followed by what looked like a dining chair. The air smelled damp and metallic, and every step felt like a battle against the current. Stay close, I called back to Mrs. Hart and Ellie. The old woman nodded, clutching Ellie's hand tightly. Ellie's wide, frightened eyes stayed glued to me, her other hand gripping the belt loop of my soaked jeans. We moved cautiously, stepping where we could see solid ground beneath the water. Fallen power lines dangled precariously in the distance, crackling ominously. I kept my eyes darting from one hazard to another, trying to find the safest route. Suddenly, Ellie stumbled. She let out a yelp as the current pulled her tiny frame sideways. My heart leapt as I lunged forward, grabbing her wrist just as she slipped under. My fingers closed around her arm, and I pulled her up with all my strength. Got you, I panted, holding her against me. Her little body was trembling, her tears mixing with the rain. I'm scared, she whispered. I know, sweetheart, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But I've got you, okay? We're going to be fine. Mrs. Hart placed a reassuring hand on Ellie's shoulder, her own face pale but determined. You're doing so well, Ellie. Just keep holding on. We pressed forward, the current growing stronger. As we turned a corner, a familiar sight stopped me dead in my tracks. My old house, or what was left of it. The front door was wide open, water rushing in and out like a tide. Furniture floated inside, bumping against the walls. On the second floor, leaning out of the bedroom window, was Liam. He looked drenched and desperate, waving his arms wildly. Mia! He shouted when he saw me. Mia, help me! For a moment, I just stared at him. The same man who had thrown me out in the rain without a second thought was now begging for my help. My chest tightened with a mix of anger, pain, and something I couldn't quite name. Mia, Mrs. Hart said quietly, we can leave him. He doesn't deserve your help. Ellie clung to me, her small voice chiming in. Was he mean to you? They were right. Every logical part of me wanted to turn around and walk away. But as much as I hated him in that moment, I couldn't let someone drown, not even Liam. Stay here, I said, my voice firm. Hold on to each other and stay safe. Mrs. Hart frowned but nodded. Be careful, dear. I waded toward the house, the current threatening to knock me off my feet. I grabbed hold of the porch railing and used it to pull myself closer. Liam! I shouted. Can you get to the door? It's jammed, he yelled. I'm stuck. I clenched my jaw, trying to figure out my next move. The stairs were completely submerged, and the water inside was rising fast. Hang on, I called, moving to the side of the house. A drain pipe ran up the wall to the second floor. It wasn't stable, but it was my only option. Gripping the slippery pipe, I climbed hand over hand, my muscles screaming in protest. When I reached the window, Liam grabbed my arm, his eyes wide with relief. You came, he said, his voice trembling. I thought you wouldn't. I didn't respond. I swung one leg over the sill and pulled myself inside. We need to move now, I said curtly. The house isn't going to hold much longer. Liam nodded, and together we made our way back to the window. I went out first, testing the pipe to make sure it could handle both of us. Come on, I said, holding out a hand. Liam followed, his movements shaky but determined. When we reached the ground, Mrs. Hart and Ellie were waiting, their faces a mix of relief and apprehension. Thank you, Liam said, his voice barely audible. He looked at me, water dripping from his hair and face. I owe you. I cut him off. Let's go, I said, my tone flat. We're not safe yet. Without another word, I turned and led the group back into the floodwaters, determined to get us all to safety, even if my heart was still raw from what Liam had done. The rain was relentless, drumming on everything like it was trying to drown out our thoughts. The four of us trudged through the waist-deep water, each step a battle against the strong current. Liam lagged slightly behind, his presence heavy and awkward. I didn't want to look at him, but I could feel his eyes on me, burning with unspoken tension. Finally, he broke the silence. "This is all your fault," he muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. I stopped mid-step, turning to glare at him. "Excuse me?" "This morning," he said, gesturing wildly, the water splashing around him. "You couldn't just let things go. You had to make a big scene, and now look where we are." I stared at him, my anger rising with the floodwaters. "You kicked me out in the pouring rain, Liam. You threw me away like garbage so you could run back to Rachel. And now you want to blame me for this?" Ellie flinched at my sharp tone, but Mrs. Hart gave a small nod of approval. Liam opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand. "No, you don't get to talk right now," I snapped. "You don't get to act like the victim. You're here because I saved your life, even after everything you did to me." Liam's face flushed, but he said nothing, his jaw tightening. I turned back to the group and kept moving, my heart pounding from the confrontation. We finally reached an abandoned gas station, the neon sign flickering weakly above the rising water. Inside, it was dark and smelled like mildew, but it was dry. That was enough for now. As we settled in, I busied myself checking the supplies we'd managed to gather: a couple of water bottles, some granola bars, and a flashlight with barely any juice left. Mrs. Hart sat down next to me, her weathered hands resting on her knees. "You know, dear," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Men like him, they're not worth your tears." I glanced at her, unsure how to respond. She smiled faintly, her eyes distant. "I was married to a man like Liam once. Charming, selfish, always making everything my fault. It took me 20 years to realize I deserved better." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "How did you leave?" I asked quietly. Mrs. Hart's smile grew, this time with a hint of pride. "I stopped waiting for him to change. I stopped believing his promises. And I finally chose myself." Her story struck a chord deep inside me. For so long, I'd blamed myself for not being enough, for not being what Liam wanted. But maybe the problem wasn't me at all. The wind howled outside, rattling the gas station's thin walls. Ellie curled up beside me, her small body trembling as she slept. Mrs. Hart dozed off, her head resting on a stack of old newspapers. Liam sat in the corner, his face hidden in his hands. I didn't trust him, not with his sudden silence, not with his quick shift from arrogance to guilt, but I couldn't focus on that now. The sound of rushing water outside reminded me that survival was all that mattered. Around midnight, the walls groaned ominously. I jolted awake, my heart racing. Liam was already standing, peering nervously at the door. "The water's rising," he said, his voice tinged with panic. I grabbed the flashlight and checked outside. He was right. The water was creeping up, lapping at the steps of the gas station. We didn't have much time. "We need to move at first light," I said, looking at Mrs. Hart and Ellie. "We can't stay here." Mrs. Hart nodded, her expression grim. "Agreed. We'll rest as much as we can, then keep going." Liam didn't argue, which was a relief. For now, the storm had forced us into a fragile truce. But as I lay back down, listening to the rain hammering on the roof, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The flood had taken everything from us, but it was also revealing truths I could no longer ignore. The evacuation center was only a few miles away, but the path to it was blocked by a rushing river swollen from the relentless rain. The only way across was a narrow, old bridge, partially submerged and swaying ominously in the current. I swallowed hard, staring at the jagged wood and twisted metal. "We have to cross," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's the only way." Mrs. Hart looked at the bridge, then at me. "Are you sure it's safe, dear?" I wasn't, not even a little, but we didn't have a choice. "It's not safe, but staying here isn't either." Ellie clung to my hand, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't want to go on the bridge," she whispered. I knelt down, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. "I know it's scary, but I'll be right there with you. Just hold on to me, okay?" She nodded, her tiny fingers gripping mine even tighter. I stepped onto the bridge, the wood creaking loudly beneath my weight. The current roared below, dragging debris and branches downstream. My heart pounded as I forced myself forward, testing each step before fully committing. Behind me, Mrs. Hart followed, her breaths sharp and shallow. Ellie clung to my hand, her small body trembling. The rain made everything slick, and I could feel the planks shifting underfoot. "One step at a time," I said aloud, more to myself than anyone else. Halfway across, the bridge swayed violently as Liam stepped on it. He was several paces behind us, his face pale and drawn. "This thing isn't going to hold," he muttered, gripping the rope railing so hard his knuckles turned white. "It's holding for now," I called back, trying to keep my voice calm. "Just keep moving." Liam froze suddenly, staring down at the rushing water below. "I can't," he said, his voice shaking. "I can't do this." "Liam, keep moving," I shouted. The bridge groaned under the combined weight of all of us, and I could feel the tension in the ropes. "If you stay there, it's going to collapse." He shook his head, his breathing fast and shallow. "I can't," he yelled. The bridge shuddered, the ropes snapping slightly out of alignment. I turned to Mrs. Hart and Ellie. "You two go ahead," I said quickly. "I'll get him." Mrs. Hart nodded, her face tight with worry, and carefully guided Ellie forward. I turned back to Liam and moved toward him, every step making the bridge sway more violently. "Liam," I said, keeping my voice firm but calm. "You have to move." He looked at me, his eyes wild with panic. I can't do it, Mia." "Yes, you can," I said, grabbing his arm. "You don't have a choice." Liam's grip on the rope railing slipped as the bridge jolted again. He stumbled, pulling me toward the edge with him. My feet scrambled for traction, my hands clutching the rope tightly. For a moment, I thought we were both going over. With a burst of adrenaline, I yanked him back onto the bridge, my muscles burning from the effort. "Move!" I shouted, pushing him forward. "One step at a time. Don't look down. Just go." He stumbled ahead, clutching the ropes for dear life. I followed close behind, my legs shaking. Finally, we reached the other side, where Mrs. Hart and Ellie were waiting. I collapsed onto the muddy ground, gasping for breath. Liam sat down heavily beside me, his hands shaking. "Thanks," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. I turned to him, my chest still heaving. "I've saved you twice today, Liam. Don't expect a third." His head snapped up, and for a moment he looked like he wanted to argue, but then he saw the anger and resolve in my face, and he closed his mouth. I stood up, brushing mud off my soaked jeans. "Let's go. We're not safe yet." As we started walking again, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, exhaustion, and a sliver of pride. The old Mia might have frozen on that bridge, paralyzed by fear, but not anymore. Something had shifted in me, and I wasn't going to let anything or anyone pull me down again. The muddy, waterlogged road seemed endless, but at last the makeshift evacuation center came into view. Tents and tarps dotted the hilltop, with people huddled together in blankets, holding on to what little they could save. Emergency vehicles buzzed in and out, their sirens drowned by the sound of pouring rain. "We made it," I murmured, my voice cracking with relief. My legs felt like jelly as we climbed the last incline. Ellie clung to my hand, her wide eyes scanning the crowd anxiously. "Will my mommy and daddy be here?" she whispered. I knelt beside her, brushing a wet strand of hair from her face. "We're going to find them, sweetheart. Let's tell the responders your name, and they'll help us." A frazzled woman in a reflective vest approached us, clipboard in hand. "Can I help you?" "This is Ellie," I said, holding the little girl's hand tightly. "She got separated from her parents in the flood." The woman crouched down, speaking softly to Ellie. "What's your full name, honey? Do you know your parents' names?" Ellie nodded timidly and rattled off the details. The woman smiled reassuringly. "Good job. We'll find them, I promise." I felt Ellie's hand slip from mine as the responder gently led her away to the family reunification area. My chest ached watching her go, but for the first time in hours, I felt hopeful. She was in good hands. I turned to Mrs. Hart, who sat heavily on a bench, her hands trembling as she held a cup of lukewarm tea someone had handed her. She looked so small and frail in the chaos around us. I sat down beside her. "You did so much today, Mrs. Hart," I said. "You're stronger than you think." She gave a soft, tired laugh. Oh, Mia, you're the strong one. I don't know what would have happened to me if you hadn't come along. Her words made my throat tighten, but I smiled. We made it together. Mrs. Hart reached out, patting my hand. Don't let anyone ever tell you you're not enough. You're remarkable, my dear. I nodded, swallowing back the emotion that threatened to spill over. For so long, I had felt invisible, a shadow in my own life. But in the last 12 hours, I had proven to myself that I was more than enough. As I sat there, catching my breath, I saw Liam approach, his clothes still soaked and clinging to him. He looked disheveled and uneasy, shifting on his feet like a scolded child. Mia, he started, his voice low and hesitant. I owe you an apology. I said nothing, letting him stumble through his rehearsed lines. I made a mistake, he continued, leaving you, treating you the way I did. It was wrong. I see that now. The flood, everything that happened, it's given me perspective. I let out a bitter laugh, standing to face him. You didn't need a flood to show me who you really are, Liam. I've always known. He flinched but pressed on. We could start over, you know. We've been through so much. It's not too late. I folded my arms, looking him square in the eye. You threw me out in the rain for your first love. You made your choice, Liam. I survived without you, and I'll keep surviving without you. His face fell, his attempt at charm crumbling under my unwavering gaze. I thought you'd understand. I do, I said. I understand perfectly. You were looking out for yourself, just like you always do. Liam opened his mouth to argue but thought better of it. I turned away, leaving him standing there in the rain, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. As I walked back toward Mrs. Hart, a strange sense of peace washed over me. The rain had finally slowed to a drizzle, and I felt lighter, like I had shed years of pain and self-doubt. I didn't need Liam's validation or anyone else's. I had proven to myself, in the most impossible of circumstances, that I could stand on my own 2 feet, and for the first time in years, I felt whole. No, the rain had stopped by the time I sat down on the edge of the cot someone had offered me. I pulled a scratchy blanket tighter around my shoulders, staring out at the sea of people in the evacuation center. Mothers cradled their children, elderly couples huddled together, and volunteers moved tirelessly, offering food, water, and comforting words. The flood had taken so much from us, but it hadn't taken our humanity. I glanced down at my hands, still scraped and red from climbing rooftops and pulling others to safety. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't see weakness in myself. I saw strength. I thought about everything that had happened. Liam throwing me out in the rain, the rising waters, saving Mrs. Hart and Ellie, and even pulling Liam from our flooded house. It felt like a lifetime compressed into a single chaotic day. And through it all, I had survived. Liam's words still echoed in my mind, but instead of the hurt they used to bring, I felt a strange sense of detachment. His apology, his pleas, they no longer had power over me. The person who had depended on his approval, who had quietly endured his criticisms and neglect, was gone. I was someone new now. The flood had destroyed so much. Homes, businesses, memories. But as I looked around, I began to see it differently. It wasn't just destruction. It was a chance to rebuild, to start over. Just as the river would eventually retreat and the town would rebuild, I would too. I whispered to myself, this isn't the end. It's a new beginning. And I meant it. As I sat there, a voice broke through my thoughts. Mia, you okay? I looked up to see Mrs. Hart. Her kind eyes, rimmed with exhaustion, reminded me of the comfort she'd offered me throughout the day. She held 2 cups of coffee, handing me one. I figured you could use this. Thanks, I said, taking a sip. The warmth spread through me, grounding me. How are you holding up? Better thanks to you, she said. I don't know what I would have done without you today. Her words reminded me of Ellie, now in the care of rescue workers, waiting to be reunited with her parents. And the other faces I'd seen, strangers who had become part of my story. I realized that even in the darkest moments, there were connections, a shared humanity that could pull us through. I stood up, looking around the crowded space. Volunteers bustled about, but there were still so many people who needed help. I turned to Mrs. Hart. I'm going to see if they need more hands. Want to join me? She smiled, setting down her cup. I thought you'd never ask. Together, we walked over to a group of volunteers organizing supplies. They handed us tasks, distributing blankets, comforting frightened children, helping people fill out forms to locate missing loved ones. It wasn't glamorous or easy, but it felt meaningful. As I moved from person to person, offering a kind word or a helping hand, I realized I wasn't just helping them. I was helping myself, too. Every small act of kindness reminded me that I was more than what Liam had made me believe. I was capable, resourceful, and strong. By the end of the night, I was physically exhausted but emotionally lighter. Mrs. Hart and I returned to our cots, collapsing into the thin mattresses with weary smiles. You did good today, Mia, she said. Real good. Thanks, I replied, my voice soft but steady. I think I needed today, as strange as that sounds. It hurt, but it also showed me what I'm capable of. Mrs. Hart nodded, her eyes closing. Sometimes it takes a storm to show us who we are. Her words stayed with me long after she drifted to sleep. I thought about the storm, not just the flood, but the storm of my relationship with Liam. For years, I had let myself be swept away by his neglect and manipulation, believing I wasn't enough. Today, I had fought through an actual flood and come out stronger. If I could survive that, I could survive anything. As I lay there staring at the ceiling of the evacuation center, I thought about Liam one last time. I didn't feel anger or hatred anymore. I didn't even feel regret. I felt free. Free from the need to prove myself to him. Free from the weight of his criticism. Free to live my life on my own terms. I whispered to myself, I'm letting you go, Liam, for good. And for the first time in years, I meant it. The morning sun filtered through the cracks of my temporary housing unit, a modest but clean space provided by the disaster relief organization I now worked for. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. I sipped my coffee, scrolling through the latest updates on the town's recovery efforts. Each day brought progress. Roads were cleared, families were reunited, and the community began piecing itself back together. The job had come as a surprise. A week after the flood, one of the volunteers I had worked with at the evacuation center approached me. You're a natural at organizing and helping people, they said. We could use someone like you in disaster coordination. I hesitated at first, unsure if I was ready to commit to something new, but the thought of sitting idly, consumed by the memories of Liam and everything I had lost, was unbearable. So, I said yes, and it turned out to be one of the best decisions I'd ever made. Every day was hard work, sorting supplies, scheduling volunteers, and coordinating rescue efforts, but it felt meaningful. I wasn't just rebuilding my life, I was helping rebuild an entire community. The people I met along the way became a support system I didn't know I needed. We shared stories, laughter, and even tears. For the first time in years, I felt connected to something bigger than myself. Walking through the town weeks later, it was clear that things were far from normal, but there was a renewed sense of hope in the air. Businesses reopened, children played in the streets, and neighbors came together to repair each other's homes. I visited Mrs. Hart one afternoon, bringing groceries to her temporary shelter. She hugged me tightly and said, Mia, you're the reason I'm still standing. Don't you forget that. Her words warmed me. I had been so focused on surviving that I hadn't realized how much I had grown. I wasn't the same woman Liam threw out into the rain. I was stronger now, and I owed that to the flood, not for what it took, but for what it forced me to find in myself. News about Liam came through the grapevine, as it always did in small towns. His house, once a symbol of his superiority, was reduced to rubble. Rachel, who had been quick to swoop in and replace me, abandoned him shortly after the flood. She had no interest in sticking around when he had nothing left to offer. He's staying at a friend's couch, I hear, Mrs. Hart mentioned one day, still blaming the world for his problems. I felt nothing for him now, not anger, not pity. He had made his choices, and life had caught up with him. That evening, I stood by the riverbank, looking at the water that had once swept away my world. It wasn't terrifying anymore. It was just water, flowing on its way. And like it, I was moving forward too. The keys jingled in my hand as I unlocked the door to my new apartment. It wasn't much, a small one-bedroom in the city with creaky floors and outdated appliances, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a space that was truly my own. No memories of Liam, no shadows of who I used to be, just me and the beginning of a fresh start. Moving to the city had been a leap of faith, but it felt like the right one. The disaster relief job had transitioned into a full-time position, and I now worked with a team coordinating recovery efforts across the region. It was rewarding, challenging, and everything I hadn't realized I was looking for. My first paycheck went toward essentials: furniture, groceries, and a new laptop. Standing in my apartment, surrounded by mismatched chairs and a bed I assembled myself, I felt a sense of pride that I hadn't experienced in years. Every little thing in the space, every step forward, was something I had earned. One morning, I woke before sunrise and decided to take a walk to the river. The city's riverbank was calmer than the one in the small town I had left behind, but it carried the same steady rhythm of flowing water. I stood there, letting the cool breeze brush against my skin as the first rays of sunlight stretched across the horizon. A lot had changed in a short amount of time. The flood had torn apart my old life, but it had also washed away the parts of me that had been holding on to things I didn't need: people, doubts, and fears. What was left was someone stronger, more resilient, someone I was finally proud to be.